If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The desert stretched in every direction under a pale white sun, the kind that burned skin and stripped the world of color. Heat pressed down on the ground until it cracked, and the cowboy felt each step bite through the soles of his boots. His shirt clung to his back, damp from sweat that had long since dried to salt, and his canteen swung light at his side. He already knew it was nearly empty. His name wasn't spoken often anymore in the towns he left behind. A man with a scar down his jaw and a record of fights he hadn't started but couldn't walk away from didn't get many second chances. He had buried one too many regrets. Men he had shot, friends he had lost, and the kind of trust he knew he didn't deserve. Out here in the desert, there was at least silence. Silence didn't judge him. He had no mission beyond staying ahead of the past and seeing another sunrise. But hunger had been gnawing at him for 2 days, and water ran shorter than that. He had been planning to angle north toward a rocky ridge where he knew a seep sometimes gave a mouthful if the season hadn't baked it dry. He wasn't looking for anyone. He wasn't looking for anything. That's when he saw her. She stood in the open, leaning on one leg, the other bound with a strip of cloth darkened by dry blood. Her skin was dusted with earth, her hair tangled with sweat and grit, and her breath came sharp but steady. She was Apache. He could see it in her clothing, in the beads at her neck, in the way she didn't shrink when she noticed him. She looked right at him as if daring him to take one more step closer. The cowboy stopped. His throat was dry, but the tightness in his chest wasn't just from thirst. It was the unease of finding someone broken down in the same wilderness where he had come to be alone. He raised both hands slowly, empty palms forward. He thought, she's wounded, cornered, and probably hates the sight of me. If I walk on, I live with myself. If I stay, I risk her thinking I'm another enemy. But I can't leave her like this. He set his canteen down on a flat rock halfway between them. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. Water. Her gaze didn't soften. She didn't thank him. She just studied him for a long breath, then limped forward and took it. She tilted her head back and swallowed twice, controlled, like someone who had learned to ration before. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and straightened, still swaying on the bad leg. He noticed then that she wasn't about to collapse, not because she wasn't exhausted, but because she refused to. Something in her posture told him she would rather fall dead where she stood than let him see weakness. The cowboy knelt, slow and deliberate, and pointed to the bandage around her thigh, then tapped his saddlebag. He didn't move closer until she gave the smallest nod. Together they shifted into the shade of a low boulder. Her wound was messy, not fresh, but not clean either. He unpacked a strip of linen, poured a splash of his dwindling water over it, and worked with careful hands. He didn't meet her eyes while he cleaned away the dirt and old blood, only focused on the wound and the way her leg trembled under the touch. Inside, his thoughts pulled hard at him. She doesn't trust me. Maybe she shouldn't. But if I walk away, she won't see another night. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She only watched him with the same steady eyes. When he finished, he wrapped the bandage tight and neat, then leaned back and set the leg down carefully. His chest ached with unease. He had come out here to be alone, to outrun the kind of ties that always ended in pain. Yet here she was, dropped into his path like some trial he hadn't asked for. He wanted to stand up and leave her to fate. But when he looked at her again, dust-streaked, half-broken, still upright, he knew he couldn't. And she, for her part, thought, another man, another stranger. Men break more promises than they keep. But he did not take more than I allowed. That counts for something. They sat in silence as the desert sun slid across the rock. The cowboy leaned back on his palms, eyes scanning the horizon, knowing night would come soon and with it decisions. She held the canteen in her lap, fingers firm around it, as if testing whether she could trust him enough to hand it back. Neither spoke, but both were already measuring what it meant to be caught together in a land that offered no mercy. The sun dipped lower, but it gave no relief. The heat only turned sharp and dry as the shadows stretched. The cowboy built a small fire from brush he had gathered earlier, his motions deliberate, making sure she saw his hands every time he reached for something. He had learned enough to know sudden moves meant trouble when mistrust already hung in the air. The Apache woman sat across from him, the canteen resting in her lap. She hadn't given it back yet. That detail did not escape him, and he did not ask for it. He figured she wanted to see if he would demand it. He wouldn't. He pulled a strip of jerky from his saddlebag, hard as wood, and dropped it into his tin cup with a splash of water. He held it close to the fire, letting the meat soften. She watched him closely, her face expressionless but her eyes alert, never leaving his hands. He wondered if she was deciding whether he was useful or dangerous. Inside, he thought about why she was here, alone, bleeding, stranded in country that would kill even the strong in a few days without water. He knew raiders had been moving through the territory, some Mexican, some white, some renegades from her own people who had been forced out of their bands. He had seen the smoke of burned camps on the horizon days earlier. He suspected hers had been one of them. He did not ask, because questions meant prying, and prying bred anger. When a meat softened enough, he nudged the cup toward her across the dirt. She lifted it, smelled it first, then ate in steady bites. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. She handed the cup back, but with a small nod, barely visible. He took it as the first sign that she accepted he was not there to harm her. The fire popped, the smell of fat hung in the air, and the silence between them carried weight. She broke it at last. Her voice was low but firm, steady even though exhaustion pressed against it. "You will be my husband now." The words hit him harder than he expected. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. He shook his head slowly. "No, not mine, not yours. I walk alone." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't flinch, didn't soften. Not for love, for survival. Two walk longer than one. One alone dies in this place. He held her stare. His mind ran circles. She wants to bind me, or maybe she just wants to use me. Either way, I swore I'd never belong again. Too many graves behind me already. His stomach turned with the old guilt of faces he couldn't forget. He wanted to tell her she was safer without him. But the way she held herself, sitting upright with a bleeding leg, commanding him like she still had ground to stand on, he couldn't dismiss her. Night came hard. Coyotes called from far off, and the desert wind picked up grit and tossed it across the fire. He laid his coat across his knees, then after a moment slid it over to her side without a word. She pulled it over her shoulders, her face giving away nothing. Inside, though, he saw her fingers curl into the fabric like someone who hadn't been given comfort in a long time. She gathered a handful of twigs and leaned forward, feeding the fire when it faltered. He watched her closely, realizing she wasn't waiting for him to do everything. She was showing him she would carry her part, even on one leg. The questions that had been left hanging in the first moments of meeting her circled his mind. Her name, what happened to her family, why she chose that word husband instead of companion or partner. He knew those questions sat heavy in the heads of any who might watch their story unfold. So he asked carefully, voice even, "What drove you out here alone?" Her eyes fixed on him through the firelight. She let the silence stretch, testing him, maybe deciding if he was worth the truth. Finally, she answered in short, clipped words. "Raiders came. They burned. They killed. Some were taken. Some scattered. I ran." He nodded once. No more questions. The pieces fit. She had nothing left but survival, and survival in her eyes meant binding him with that one word. Husband. He lay back on the ground, his bedroll under his head, eyes on the stars cutting sharp across the sky. She sat wrapped in his coat, her back against the boulder, her face turned to the flames. Neither thanked the other. Neither trusted the other fully. But both understood that by morning, they were no longer strangers who had crossed by chance. The desert had put them together, and the desert didn't often waste its trials. The morning came fast, sharp and white. The cowboy opened his eyes to the sound of coyotes still calling far off, their cries fading with the light. His body ached from the hard ground, but his mind was already on water. The canteen was nearly dry, lighter than air when he lifted it. He thought back to the seep he had found once years ago, tucked in the rock west of here, where gravel and stone sometimes gave just enough to keep a man alive. It wasn't certain, but it was the only chance they had. The woman was awake already, sitting upright, his coat still draped across her shoulders. She was watching him, her face set firm, her wound already showing fresh blood through the cloth. He knew the walk would be hard on her. He also knew that leaving her behind wasn't an option. If she tried to wait for him, she'd be carrying by nightfall. He crouched by the fire pit, drawing a circle in the dust with his finger, then marked a line to the west. There, he said. Water. Maybe. She studied the marks, then raised her eyes to him. I'll walk with you. His jaw tightened. He wanted to say no, to tell her it was too far, too rough, that she would slow him down. He pictured her stumbling, falling, bleeding out in the dirt while he wasted precious hours trying to drag her. But her tone left no room for argument. She would not be left behind. He gave a single nod. Then we go slow. They broke camp with little to pack. His bedroll tied tight to the saddle, the tin cup hooked at his belt, the canteen hanging almost weightless. She leaned on a stick she had cut the night before, testing her bad leg with each step. He walked half a pace ahead, his eyes scanning the ground and horizon. He wasn't worried about losing the trail. He knew this country, but about what else might be out there. Raiders, bandits, men who would see a lone woman as prey. He had left the towns to escape such men. Now, somehow, he found himself standing between her and that very danger. The land gave no mercy. Heat rose in waves, and the air smelled of stone and dust. Her breathing grew heavy as the hours dragged. Twice she faltered, her leg shaking hard, and twice he stopped without touching her, letting her set the pace. Inside, he fought the urge to take her arm. He remembered the look in her eyes when she told him she had no use for empty promises. If he grabbed her without consent, even in kindness, she'd see it as the same claim all other men had made before. So he waited. Each time, she steadied herself, swallowed her pain, and nodded for him to move on. At last, near midday, the ridge rose before them. To anyone else it looked like nothing but baked stone and loose gravel, but he knew where to look. He crouched low, pulling out his knife, and dug at a spot where the soil darkened under a slab of rock. At first, nothing. Then, a slow dampness spread into the dirt, and a thin trickle pushed through. Relief hit him hard, a weight lifting from his chest. He guided the trickle into the canteen, letting the slow drip fill. The woman watched in silence, but her shoulders dropped, her face loosening in a way that showed how close she had been to breaking. When the canteen was half full, he rinsed it, cleared the grit, then set it under the seep again. He handed her the first drink, watching as she took measured swallows, just enough to wet her mouth and throat before passing it back. That told him something about her. She knew the desert as well as he did, knew that greed killed faster than thirst. They sat side by side in the thin shade of the ridge, backs against the stone. For a long time, neither spoke. The cowboy turned the canteen in his hands, thinking about how much had changed in a single day. He had left the towns to outrun people. Yet here he was, carrying one with him, a stranger, a woman with her own rules and her own grief. He told himself it was temporary, just until she healed, just until water was no longer scarce. But deep down, he felt the lie in that thought. Her voice cut through the still air. You ask no questions. He glanced at her, measuring his reply. Questions take what ain't mine to take. Her eyes softened, almost the first sign of anything other than hardness since he had met her. She looked back out across the flatland. Her words came plain, stripped of emotion. Raiders came. My mother and father stayed. My brothers fought. Some were taken. Some are gone. I ran. He listened, his jaw tight, saying nothing. The silence between her words told him more than the words themselves. He thought of the graves behind him, of his own family long gone, of the towns that had turned him into something less than a man. He felt a thread of understanding he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. He wanted to tell her his own story, how violence had followed him like a shadow, how he had tried to walk away, but never could. But his throat closed up. Words like that once spoken were hard to put back. Instead, he took a short drink from the canteen, passed it back, and let the silence hold them. By the time the sun lowered, the canteen was full. They rose together, moving slow, leaning into the heat, but steadier now. The cowboy looked once at her, seeing the grit in her eyes, the blood on her leg, the way she did not bend. He thought, she might just be stronger than me. That night, when they made camp again under the same wide sky, something had shifted. They weren't just two strangers crossing paths anymore. They had shared water, the one thing the desert made sacred. And in the desert, that counted for more than any words. The fire was low that night, burning more smoke than flame, because brush was scarce and every twig mattered. The cowboy sat close to it, sharpening his knife with slow strokes. Across from him, the woman leaned against the boulder, his coat still drawn tight over her shoulders, her face lit in half shadow. The silence was not heavy anymore, but it was not easy either. It was the kind that tested whether two people could sit without words and still stay. When the rabbit trail appeared the next morning, it was the cowboy who noticed first. Fresh tracks cut across the dust, light prints, the kind made when a cottontail moved quick through scrub. He crouched down, motioning for her to stay still. She limped closer, balancing on her stick, her eyes sharp. He pulled a bit of wire from his saddlebag and began working a snare. His movements were practiced, precise. She watched, studying every twist and knot. And for the first time, he felt her gaze wasn't about mistrust, but about learning. The snare was set near a tuft of dry grass, and they waited. The hours dragged under a harsh sun. He squatted in the shade of a mesquite stump, hat tipped low, while she sat nearby, her wounded legs stretched out in the dirt. She didn't complain, didn't shift restlessly, just watched the horizon with the patience of someone raised in hard country. When the snare snapped, the rabbit thrashed, and he moved fast, quiet, swift in the way men who had hunted for their own survival always did. In moments it was done. He skinned it with clean cuts, his hands steady. She built the fire herself this time, gathering twigs with her own effort despite the limp, blowing softly until the flames took. He noticed the determination and said nothing. As the rabbit cooked, the smell carried in the still air. His stomach clenched with hunger, but he held back. He broke off a piece and handed it toward her. She shook her head, tore off a smaller bite, and pushed it back at him first. That unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made his chest feel tight. He chewed the meat without looking at her, then offered the rest. She ate it without hesitation. The exchange was wordless, but it carried weight. For him, it stirred memories he had pushed down, of nights on trail drives, when food was passed around the fire, of his younger brother long gone, of a time when sharing meant family. For her, it was something different. She had lost her people, but in this act, she was testing if a stranger could hold to balance instead of taking more than a share. That evening, as the fire settled into glowing coals, she spoke again. "You will be my husband." The words were less of a command than before, but still not soft. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the embers. "I'm not a husband to anyone." Her face stayed steady. "Not husband for love. Husband for fire, for food, for standing when I cannot." His hand tightened on the knife resting in the dirt beside him. The word unsettled him, not because of her, but because of what it demanded. In his mind, he heard the voices of women he had failed, the judgment of townsfolk who had seen only his scars and his violence. He thought, if I agree, I chain her to my mistakes. If I refuse, I leave her to die. Both ways, I carry blame. She watched him, seeing the conflict even though he didn't speak it. She pressed further, her voice flat, not pleading. Two are stronger than one. Alone, you'll die also. He finally looked at her then, really looked. Dust streaked her face, her wound still raw, but her eyes were unbroken. He didn't answer. He didn't trust his own voice. That night, as the wind rose and the fire crackled low, he slid his coat over her shoulders once again before lying back on the hard earth. She pulled it tight, and her fingers curled into the fabric. He saw it, though he pretended not to. She reached for more twigs and fed the fire, her small act saying what words didn't. She was willing to give back what she could, even injured. What the audience might have asked after the first chapters, the woman's strength beyond her wound, whether she could still provide, whether he would care for her without turning it into ownership, was now answered in these small gestures. She could hunt with her eyes, feed a fire with her hands, stand on her own even in pain. And he, despite his silence, was already watching her as someone who could match him, not weigh him down. They slept close to the same fire, the line between them still wide, but shifting. Neither thanked the other, neither promised anything. But both knew that tomorrow would demand more choices. And in the desert, choices never stayed small. By the fifth day, the desert reminded them how fragile survival was. The air turned restless at noon, a wind picking up from the south, carrying with it a wall of dust that moved across the basin like a living thing. The cowboy saw it first, a brown haze on the horizon, and he knew what was coming. He dropped to one knee, checking the ground, and pointed toward a shallow arroyo cut into the land. "There," he said quickly. "Down." The Apache woman nodded once, not wasting words. She limped fast, leaning on her stick, while he carried the bedroll and saddlebag. They slid down into the arroyo just as the storm slammed into them. Sand filled the air until it stung the skin raw. The wind howled like a train, the kind of sound that could rattle a man's teeth. He threw the bedroll over both their heads and pressed her down against the bank. The grit poured over them, filling their ears and mouths. Inside that cocoon of canvas and dust, he thought about how easily this could end. One bad choice of cover, and they'd be buried. He felt her shoulder pressed tight against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. His instinct told him to shield her with his body, but he held back just enough, not wanting her to feel smothered or owned. She didn't pull away. That was answer enough. When the storm passed, silence fell heavy. The desert looked different now. The ground freshly scoured, their tracks erased. He pushed the bedroll off them and coughed grit from his throat. Her hair was caked with sand, her face streaked, but she was still sitting upright, still unbroken. Her wound, though, had swollen. The bandage was tight, skin around it red and hot. Infection. He cursed under his breath. Digging into his saddlebag, he pulled out a small pouch of dried herbs he'd carried since a long-ago camp with a Mexican healer who had shown him how to grind and boil them for infection. He boiled water in the tin cup, crushed the herbs with the flat of his knife, and spoke the steps aloud as he worked. Clean. Powder. Wrap. She watched him carefully, as if testing whether he knew what he was doing or if he was guessing. When he pressed the poultice to her leg, she didn't flinch, though her jaw clenched tight. He saw the tendons in her neck strain, her fists curl into the dirt. For a moment, he almost asked her name, because working over her like this without knowing it felt wrong. But he held back. Not yet. She would tell him when she chose. As he wrapped the cloth, he thought about how the audience, the kind of people who heard stories told around firelight or in town saloons, would have questions. Could she walk on that leg much longer? Could he keep carrying both of them with his supplies already stretched thin? Was he only helping out of pity, or was there something deeper forming? His own mind echoed those same doubts. He told himself it was duty, but the truth pressed heavier than that. He didn't want her to die, not because of him, not while he had hands to stop it. That night, he insisted on keeping the first watch. She was too weak, he told himself. But near midnight, she shook his boot and whispered, "Sleep. I watch now." Her voice was calm, her eyes sharp even in the low firelight. She held a stick in her hand like a spear, steady as stone. He wanted to argue, but exhaustion weighed him down. He lay back, eyes still on her for a long moment, and let himself trust her. When dawn came, she woke him the same way, tapping his boot with the tip of the stick. She had fed the fire through the night, the embers still glowing. His coat was wrapped tight around her shoulders, but her posture was straight, not sagging. In that moment, something shifted between them. She wasn't just a wounded stranger leaning on him to survive. She was proving she could guard his life as much as he guarded hers. That answered one of the questions no one had spoken yet, whether this bond was one-sided. It wasn't. They were already carrying each other, in silence, through dust and danger. The cowboy poured the last of the boiled water into the tin cup, handed it to her first, then drank what she left. He tied the saddlebag shut, slung it over his shoulder, and nodded toward the horizon. North. Settlements a day and a half, if we hold. She pushed herself up, leaning on her stick, her jaw set firm. Then we hold. And without another word, they walked. The march north was slow and punishing. The cowboy's legs burned from steady pacing, his throat dry even after measured swallows, but his eyes stayed sharp on the horizon. He kept listening for hooves, voices, gunfire, anything that would mean trouble. The woman moved beside him with her stick, dragging her bad leg, but never asking to stop. He kept glancing at her, watching for signs she might collapse. She saw him watching and gave him nothing. No weakness, no plea. By late morning, heat shimmered off the flats, and a faint clop of hooves reached them before the rider appeared. A man came into view leading a thin mule with 2 canvas sacks slung across its sides. He wore a battered hat, shirt stuck with sweat, his face pale under a coat of dust. A traitor. The cowboy tensed immediately. Strangers out here rarely meant luck. The trader squinted, pulling his mule to a halt a few yards off. His eyes moved over the cowboy, then slid to the woman, lingering on her wound, on the coat around her shoulders. That look made the cowboy shift forward by a step, not aggressive, just enough to block the line of sight. "You two look like you're about spent," the trader called. His voice was nasal, oily. "Got water. Pork too, but it'll cost." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He hated men who saw desperation as profit. Still, water meant life. He asked flatly, "How much?" The trader licked his lips, eyed the woman again, then named a price twice what it was worth. The cowboy shook his head, spit in the dirt, and countered with less. They stood locked for a tense moment. The woman leaned heavier on her stick, but said nothing. The trader's eyes darted, calculating, until finally he nodded with a sour grin. "Fine. Better you than nobody." They sat on 3 rocks under a stub of shade, chewing salted meat in slow bites. The trader talked without pause, about a settlement north with a pump that actually worked, about outlaws drifting east, about soldiers who came and went but never stayed. His words carried the sharpness of a man who lived on scraps and lies. When he looked at the woman again, his smile widened in a way the cowboy didn't like. "We'll head north," the cowboy said firmly, cutting the man's story short. "You take the east track." The trader chuckled. "Maybe, maybe not. Roads cross often enough." The cowboy didn't blink, his hand resting near his belt though he hadn't drawn. His voice came low, steady. "East." The mule brayed, restless. The trader finally spat and tugged the rope, turning eastward. He muttered something under his breath, but didn't look back. When a man was gone, the woman spoke. "You stood in front like a wall." The cowboy wiped the salt from his lips with the back of his hand. "Didn't mean to be. Walls hold until doors are made," she said. Her voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't hard either. He didn't answer. Her words pressed into him, heavier than he wanted to admit. Inside, he wrestled with it. He had always avoided being a wall for anyone. Walls get battered until they break. But something about the way she said it made it sound less like a burden and more like a fact of survival. They pushed on, slower now, the pork sitting heavy in their stomachs, but giving strength. By late afternoon, they reached a shallow spring tucked in a fold of ground. Cottonwoods lined the edge, and dragonflies skimmed the water. Relief came sharp and sudden. They both knelt at the bank, cupping the dark water, washing dust from their faces. For the first time in days, the cowboy let himself breathe easy. That night, they made camp under the trees. He scrubbed his shirt, hung it over a branch, the scars across his chest showing pale in the firelight. She watched him without shame and without judgment, as if scars meant nothing out here. She washed her hair, combing dust from it with her fingers, and when she sat back down, she looked younger, though her eyes stayed old. They ate the last of the pork with beans he had carried in a cloth roll. It was simple food, plain, but it felt like more than that. She looked at him across the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes, and said again, "You will be my husband." Her tone carried less command, more certainty. He stared at the fire a long while before answering. "If I say yes, it won't be with songs or flowers. It'll be daily, hard, plain." She didn't hesitate. "I did not ask for songs. I asked for daily." Her words settled over the camp like another kind of truth, one heavier than the dust storm or the trader's eyes. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he didn't feel the need to argue. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. And that silence between them felt closer to an agreement than any vow. Morning broke clearer than any they'd had since meeting, the air still, the sun sharp but not yet unbearable. The cowboy woke to the sound of birds in the cottonwoods and the steady trickle of water at the spring. He sat up, rubbed the grit from his eyes, and saw the woman already awake, her coat draped around her shoulders, her legs stretched straight as she checked the bandage. He noticed the swelling had gone down some. The poultice had worked. Relief hit him, though he kept his face calm. He had been wondering if she'd even last the walk north. He boiled fresh water, cleaned the wound again, and tied a new strip of cloth. This time she did not just endure. She watched carefully, following each move, as if committing his methods to memory. "You've done this before," she said flatly. He paused, then gave a short nod. "I've patched up men on trail drives, after bar fights, after worse. Some lived, some didn't." Her eyes lingered on him. "You have carried much blood." The words stung because they were true. He didn't explain further. Explaining meant pulling out stories he kept buried, and those weren't for her. Or maybe they were, but not yet. By midday, they left the spring behind, their canteen full. The walk stretched long, but something had shifted. They moved more in rhythm now. Her limp steady, but not slowing them as much, his pace measured to hers without him needing to think about it. When they stopped to rest, he set his hat low, dozing lightly, and trusted her to keep watch. That trust was unspoken but clear, and it answered one of the questions that might have hung in any listener's mind. Could he trust her as much as she had begun to trust him? As they walked, the cowboy finally asked what had been gnawing at him. Why that word, husband? Not just partner, not companion. She walked a few more steps before answering. Because husband binds. Men leave when there is no binding. A husband cannot leave without shame. He mulled that over. It unsettled him because he knew she was right. His whole life had been built on leaving, on walking away before anyone could stop him. Her words stripped him of that escape. Yet, he realized she was giving him more choice than anyone else ever had. She wasn't begging. She wasn't bargaining. She was stating her law, and if he chose to stay, he'd be bound by it. When they reached the next rise, the land spread out below in a basin dotted with brush. Smoke lifted faint in the distance. The cowboy tensed, scanning. Could be a camp. Could be raiders. Could be settlers. He dropped to a knee, motioned for her to crouch. They watched the horizon until the wind shifted and carried the smell. Cooked beans, not burning wood. Settlement smoke, not raid smoke. His chest eased. They descended into the basin, and by late afternoon, they made another camp. He trapped another rabbit, and this time, she took the knife from him without asking and skinned it herself. Her hands weren't as quick as his, but steady. He noticed how careful she was not to waste, stripping every bit clean. Then she cooked it, turning the spit with practiced patience. Watching her, he realized she was proving she wasn't helpless, that this wasn't just him carrying her. That night, as they ate, the fire casting long shadows, she spoke again. "When we reach the settlement, you will give your name." He frowned. "And what if my name carries trouble?" "Then I will carry it also," she said simply. That answer silenced him. No one had ever said such a thing to him. Every town, every job, every face had treated his name as a curse to be avoided. Yet here she was, ready to take it without flinching. He felt a weight shift inside him, something he hadn't let himself feel in years, like maybe he could stand in one place and not run. Before sleep, he leaned back on his bedroll, staring at the stars. She pulled his coat over her shoulders, as she always did, but this time she looked at him and said, "Daily, that is all I ask." He didn't reply with words, but he reached over and pushed the canteen closer to her side, so she wouldn't need to rise in the night. That small act was his answer. For those watching their story, the unspoken questions, whether this bond was just survival, whether it would fracture once safety was near, were beginning to take form. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was something firmer, a decision shaping itself out of hardship and silence. And for the cowboy, who had only ever known leaving, the thought of staying no longer felt like a trap. The fire burned low, the night quiet around them. Neither of them said it, but both knew they were no longer two strangers waiting for the desert to decide their fate. They had already chosen, even if the words hadn't caught up yet. They reached the edge of the settlement near noon the following day, their bodies coated in dust, their clothes stiff from sweat and travel. The cowboy slowed first, scanning the cluster of buildings with a soldier's caution. He counted 3 streets, a pump near the center square, a smithy clanging steady, a general store with its porch sagging, and a saloon with a faded sign creaking in the wind. Children ran barefoot in the dirt, their voices carrying, while 2 men sat outside the saloon, eyes sharp and curious as the strangers approached. The woman walked beside him without faltering, her limp visible but controlled. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, though the heat pressed down. It wasn't for warmth, it was armor, a signal that she carried something of his now. The cowboy felt eyes on them, the same eyes that always measured him in every town. He knew what the settlement saw. A rough man with scars, a silent Apache woman wounded but unbowed. Suspicion first, whispers second, then judgment. It was always the same. He braced himself. At the pump, he filled the canteen, the squeal of the handle cutting sharp through the square. The woman stepped forward, washing her face and arms openly. People stopped to watch, not hiding their stares. She met no one's gaze, her posture calm, her movement steady, as if daring them to call her less than human. That answered one of the questions that would have lingered. Would she bend under the stares of a settlement? She did not. Inside the general store, the clerk glanced up from behind his counter. He was a thin man with a mustache that barely grew, his eyes small and calculating. His glance slid from the cowboy to the woman and back again. He reached for a blanket, held it up with a price 3 times its worth. The cowboy's jaw set. He put the blanket back on the shelf and instead asked for flour, coffee, a needle, and thread. The clerk's smirk faltered when the woman, in perfect English, spoke the total aloud, her voice carrying so the room could hear. The figures were exact, undeniable. The clerk hesitated, then gave the proper change, embarrassed by his own failure to cheat them. When they stepped back onto the porch, the sheriff was waiting. He was broad-shouldered, his hat low, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes narrowed when he saw the cowboy. Recognition flickered. "You again," the sheriff said. "We had words 2 winters back." The cowboy held his stare, calm but unyielding. "We had words. One of us was wrong. Doesn't matter now." The sheriff shifted his weight, waiting for a challenge. When none came, he jerked his chin toward the square. "Keep no trouble, and we'll keep none. That's what I'm aiming for," the cowboy replied. The woman stood silent beside him, her eyes steady on the sheriff until the man looked away first. That moment answered another unspoken question. Would she remain hidden behind the cowboy, or would she stand as equal before others? She stood firm, neither cowering nor shrinking. They found a small room behind the livery. It held a narrow cot, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a nail hammered into the wall for a lantern. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. He unpacked slowly, laying their supplies on the chair. She set about cooking flour into a thin cake on the skillet, adding a pinch of salt. The smell filled the cramped space, and when he ate it, plain and rough, it felt like a meal that marked a turning point. Food not scavenged but chosen. Later, he cleaned her bandage again, sewing the frayed edge with a new needle and thread. His hands were rough but steady, his silence careful. She didn't flinch when the thread tugged. She watched his face instead, seeing the concentration there, the way he carried her wound as if it was his own. As the evening light filtered through the cracks in the wall, he broke the silence. "Tomorrow, we see the county man. Sign our names." She studied him, then said, "I will give mine and keep my people in it." He nodded. "I'll give mine and keep my silence short when it needs to be." That settled it. No promises, no speeches. Just the simple, deliberate choice to bind themselves in the eyes of the law, as they already had in the desert. Outside, the settlement carried on, whispers running through the streets. But inside that small room, in the plainest of ways, they had already begun to carve out a place. The questions that might have haunted listeners Whether they could hold steady under the eyes of others, whether he would hide his past, whether she would stand equal, had been answered not in grand gestures, but in the daily, quiet acts that spoke louder than words. That night, as the lantern burned low, the cowboy set his hat on the nail. The woman folded his coat over her lap, and for the first time, the space felt less like a room for strangers and more like the beginning of a home. The next morning, the cowboy woke early, his body stiff from the cot, his mind already turning over the day ahead. He knew the county office wasn't just about ink and paper. It meant putting himself on record, something he had avoided for years. His name carried weight in the wrong ways, tied to bar fights, accusations, and the kind of trouble men like to pin on a scar drifter. He thought, once it's written, there's no walking away without leaving another scar on her life, too. That fear pressed heavy in his chest, but when he looked across the room and saw her already sitting straight, combing out her hair with calm movements, he knew he couldn't run this time. They stepped into the bright morning light together. The county building was a squat structure of wood and stone, its porch crowded with men waiting to register land deeds and cattle brands. The clerk inside wore a white collar too tight for the heat and a vest that looked cleaner than it had any right to in this dusty place. He raised his brows at the sight of them, his gaze flicking from the cowboy's scar to the woman's bandaged leg. The cowboy spoke first, his voice level. "We're here to bind our names." The clerk pulled out a ledger thick with names and set his ink pen ready. "Your name, age, place of birth. Both of you." His tone carried that mixture of boredom and judgment only men in authority could wear. The cowboy gave his name steady, though he felt the room tense slightly behind him. He saw a man near the door narrow his eyes, as if trying to place it. He braced for whispers, for trouble, but none came. The clerk looked at the woman next, already poised to rush her along. "And you consent?" She didn't let him skip over it. She leaned forward, her voice firm enough to fill the office. "You will ask me again, clear." The clerk hesitated, then repeated, slower this time. "Do you consent to this binding?" "Yes," she answered, her tone plain but carrying weight. Her eyes stayed locked on the man until he dipped his head back to the page, scribbling the entry. The cowboy felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he wasn't the one carrying the burden of proving worth. She had forced the room to acknowledge her choice. That answered a question any listener might have asked. Was she being pulled into this life, or was she stepping into it on her own? Her answer was unshakable. The clerk sanded the wet ink, pressed a seal into the corner of the page, and slid the document across the desk. Their names sat side by side now, black against the yellowed paper, ordinary in appearance yet final in meaning. The cowboy stared at it longer than he meant to. He thought about every town that had told him he didn't belong, every face that had looked at him as if he were already guilty. Now here was a record that said he belonged to someone and to something more than himself. Outside, the sun hit hard again and the town moved around them. The sheriff, leaning on a post, watched as they left the county office. His expression gave nothing away, but he didn't step forward, didn't test them. That in itself was a kind of acceptance. The two men from the saloon porched the day before muttered, but no challenge came. The woman walked beside the cowboy with her head high, the coat still around her shoulders. They returned to their small room behind the livery, and for the first time, they sat at the table with coins earned by their own hands. She had spent the morning mending shirts for the boarding house, the kind of work that paid in small but steady amounts. He had swept stalls, repaired a wagon wheel, and calmed a nervous horse with a soft hand. It wasn't much, but it was honest. That night, as they ate beans cooked slow over a borrowed pot, the cowboy found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. What we're doing, it isn't romance. It's work. It's daily. And I'll hold to it, if you will." She looked at him across the table, her face steady, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Daily is what I asked, and I will hold it." It was plain, it was serious, and it was final. For those watching their story, the doubts left unspoken in the beginning, whether the bond was just desperation, whether she had a choice, whether he would run again, were answered. What started in the desert out of necessity had been carried into town, written down in ink, and sealed with the weight of both their wills. The cowboy leaned back in the chair, tired but settled in a way he hadn't felt in years. She pulled his coat over her lap as she always did, but this time It was inside four walls, in a place that felt less like hiding and more like staying. The weeks after the county seal dried on the page passed in a rhythm neither of them had known in years. The cowboy worked mornings at the livery, brushing horses, repairing tack, fixing the odd wheel for passing wagons. The woman spent her days cooking for the boarding house and sewing torn shirts for drifters who paid with coins, sometimes with beans or coffee. It was simple, unglamorous work, but it filled their small tin cup with steady earnings. The livery room soon gave way to a rented cabin on the edge of town, no bigger than a single room with a lean-to kitchen, but it was theirs. The cabin became the answer to many questions that might have been lingering in the minds of anyone following their story. Would she be accepted in a settlement where whispers trailed her heritage? Would he be allowed to stay in one place without the law pushing him out? The truth revealed itself slowly, through actions, not words. Neighbors watched from a distance at first, wary of the scarred cowboy and the quiet Apache woman. But when she cooked extra bread and offered it to the widow 2 doors down, and when he helped mend a fence without being asked, suspicion turned to reluctant nods. In time, nods turned to greetings. The sheriff himself came one evening to the church supper, plate in hand, and stopped at their table. His eyes weighed the cowboy, steady as before, then shifted to the woman. After a long silence, he spoke plain. We don't need to agree on the past to live decent in the present. The cowboy set down his fork, met the man's eyes, and answered, "That's enough for me." The sheriff gave a short nod, then moved on. That was the end of the matter. Not a truce that would shatter later, an ending. Their cabin filled with signs of permanence. 3 rows of beans sprouted behind the fence, a run of corn that grew uneven but strong. A young hen scratched in the dirt near the porch. The woman hung a string of blue beads above the door, beads that had belonged to her mother, and she said nothing about them, only touched them lightly when she passed. The cowboy respected the silence, understanding it was her way of carrying her people forward. The wound in her leg healed clean, leaving a pale scar. She walked without the stick now, slower than some, but steady. When townsfolk looked at her, they no longer saw only the Apache woman who had limped into their streets. They saw the woman who baked bread, sewed shirts, and stood firm at her husband's side. And when they looked at him, they no longer saw only the drifter with a violent past. They saw the man who kept to himself, who worked steady, who never raised his voice unless it was to calm a horse or stop a quarrel before it started. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the lantern glowed warm inside, she stood in the doorway with a tin cup of coffee. She looked at him across the table and spoke a single word, "Husband." He raised his eyes, his voice even. "Wife." No hesitation passed between them. The bond wasn't survival anymore, not just necessity. It had become choice, built piece by piece in the desert, tested by storms, measured in daily acts that had bound them tighter than any ceremony. For anyone who might have doubted the ending, whether he would stay or slip away, whether she had bound herself out of desperation or free will, whether the settlement would ever accept them, the answer stood plain in that small cabin. They had chosen not to leave. They had chosen to stay. And staying was love, steady and unbroken. The story closed not with a fight, not with a farewell, but with a quiet, lasting truth. A man who thought he could never belong and a woman who thought she had lost everything had built a life together, not out of romance or promises, but out of daily work, respect, and the will to remain. The desert had tested them, and they had endured. Now the future looked plain, steady in theirs.